Windows Server 2019 Standard Edition. Welcome back everybody, myself Prakash Pradhan and I am trainer for this entire series. In our today's session we are going to learn how to install the additional domain controller in your network environment. Normally what happens, your primary domain controller is deployed, all the clients are being authenticated through the primary domain controller. But what if your primary domain controller fails to perform their tasks? It may be sometime technical issues, sometime it may be your NIC is not functioning this properly, sometime your primary server completely goes down. In that case, all of the clients are going to suffer because the authentication is done mainly from the primary domain controller. So in that case, like we have done in our previous session, DHCP failover, over here also we are going to make a failover for our primary domain controller. So that is normally known as your additional domain controller. So over here I have got my primary domain controller like we have created last time. This is my primary domain controller. Okay, see, one computer is joined over here. Now domain controller myself. So over here whatever objects are being created, that will get automatically replicated to your additional domain controller. For example, I am going to create one let's say object here. Let's say just test user. Now when I create additional domain controller, this will get replicated automatically. Okay, so let's see that. I'm going to create one user primary domain controller. After I make additional domain controller, you see that this user will be automatically replicated to your additional domain controller. So this is my primary domain controller and I'm going to create a failover of this domain in case if this primary domain controller goes down. There is always possibility, so you should have a failover plan in your network infrastructure. So in the computer where I'm going to create additional domain controller, first you need to set the IP address. That is already been done because this computer is already a part of your primary domain controller. Otherwise you will be having issues to set up this computer as an additional domain controller as your failover plan. So I'd like to show you the IP address, the configuration of my second partner server that is going to perform its tasks, or that is going to work as a additional domain controller. So I have brought certain changes in IP over here comparing to last time DHCP server. My primary domain controller is 100. This is a part of your domain controller and this is the host IP address. That means my domain is 100. Now after that if you want to promote any associated partner server as an additional domain controller, you need to have installed the role of Active Directory users and computers. So that is been already added over here. If you see, I'll show you over here Active Directory users and these computers roles are being already installed. Just I'll show you in the short over here. See, this is simply installed, configuration is not done because I want to make this server as a failover server of your primary domain controller. So I'm going to promote it as a domain controller. But during the domain controller promotion, this computer will target to the primary domain controller. If you remember in our number 2 video of day 1, while creating promoting your server into a domain controller, you have selected add a new forest because that was a completely new forest in your network environment. But right now this server or this operating system, this PC is going to perform as a duplicate copy of your primary domain controller. So in that case I am going to select add a domain controller to an existing domain. That means this PC or this server is going to act as a member actually. That means domain controller is already there, okay, but I am going to add this one. So this computer's name will get also displayed in your primary domain controller over here. Domain controller we are having only one. Now that computer will be also listed over here. Right now it is as a member. Now that will get removed from here and it will come over here as a member of your server. So let's go back. So now we need to add this. Okay, it's taking time since we are working on a virtual environment. Sometimes it takes time. Please bear with me. this physical infrastructure you're setting, I'm not having so much huge amount of RAM and the processor, so that's why it's taking time, but don't worry also. Okay, now here it comes. I'm going to add a domain controller to an existing domain. Existing domain means biotech.co is already here. But in order to associate this server as an additional domain controller or the failover plan of the primary domain controller, you need to have a proper credential. Otherwise, you are not going to have that. You will not be allowed to install the failover of your primary domain controller. So that's why you need to test your or check your credential first. Okay, so I'm going to give my domain controllers credential. So that will be administrator@biotech.co and my password of that domain controller, so that it gets authenticated and it will allow me to replicate entire objects from primary domain controller to the my failover domain controller. Otherwise, it will not allow you. Now it's going to verify. So it's saying the wizard cannot access the list of the domains. So let's search it now. It should get listed over here. Oh, password is incorrect. Sorry. So what it's saying now, let's check the password. Now it's accepted. Now this one is a read-write copy. This is the active directory in integrated DNS zone. So that's why domain name DNS server is here. Of course, the global catalog is here, and we have to set the password for the directory service restore mode. Okay, if you forget even this password, don't worry, system administrator can reset this password without any issue. Of course, this process also I'm going to teach you in a coming days. Now both the computers will be part in a first site. Both the servers will be in a site first one only, one site, not two sites. Over only one site is here. Now next, now over here it's asking you from where do you want me to replicate. Any domain controller in our environment, since we are having only one domain controller, even if I leave it as it is as any domain controller, it will not harm you. But trust me, if you have multiple domains over here, you will have to select. Otherwise, you might be trying to replicate any additional domain copy from the primary to somewhere else. So that's why I suggest you to select your own domain controller from where you are interested to replicate as a secondary. That means the failover domain controller. Now, since this server is also going to act as a failover server, that means entire NTDS folder and your sysbol has to be copied, has to be created and copied from the primary domain controller. And the meaning of all these folders are already explained when we were creating the first time domain controller in our server standard edition 2019. Now it's showing you the summary what we have selected so far. Okay, now it's telling you all these things I'm going to install. Okay, if you want to view the script, just click view the script. It will show the script that is being generated for creating all these services. Now it's going to verify everything from the primary domain controller. It's going to check entire thing, schema, your common name, okay, your objects, entire thing will be copied from the primary domain controller to the secondary. That means your failover domain controller. So that's why it will take few minutes. Okay. Now it's done. Now install. Now what it's doing over here in between, it is going to replicate the entire copy of your primary domain controller. It's making sure just that. Okay. So after this, we'll be seeing the practical duplication of primary domain controller's entire object from the primary domain controller to the failover domain controller. If you remember, I told you last time, here we had only one. That means in a computer's list, your failover domain controllers PC that was only a part of domain controller, that name was listed over here. But if you see, if I refresh it over here, now see, this name should be moved over here. It should come over here. Okay, it will come since it's doing this replication itself. Don't worry, it will get listed here. let it install properly. Then the name should be moved from there. That means we'll be having two servers, not one. So right now it's showing only one. Where is that? Okay, see here. Domain controller is only one. Afterwards, this computer will be moved over here only, because now that server will be acting as a domain controller itself. It's not only that, we'll have to bring few more changes in an IP level also, so that the failover takes place. It's installing all the DNS services, so that's why it takes time. Even if you do this in a physical machine, still it takes time. It's checking all the group policy management. If you think that we have not created any group policy, then why does it search for the group policy, or why is it trying to copy the group policy from the primary domain controller? The reason is, when you promote your Windows Server Standard Edition 2019 or any other edition of any older version of Windows Server operating system, and you promote it as a domain controller, by default one group policy will be created. So it's trying to copy that default domain controller's policy into the failover server. That's why it's searching. See, it's replicating the schema directory partition also. I do not want to skip any of the parts using any third-party software to remove all this screen. That's taking time, because sometimes it seems like a fake work also. But I want you to witness the entire thing is copied step by step. There is no cutting in this video. So if there is any error comes in between, we will face that ourselves. But I will not do some sort of trick and copy the video and display it over the cloud. We won't do that, because I am 100% confident what we are doing is right, because it's been almost 20 years I am doing the same work. See, it's copying now domain component. Schema is copied, domain component is copied, okay, default group policy is copied. Now entire things are copied from the primary domain controller to this failover domain controller. After that, we have to bring it change in an IP level. So by the time we do that, so let's see whether the replication is done from the primary, additional domain controller to the primary domain controller or not, because it works in both the direction. That means if you bring any changes in primary domain controller, that change will be replicated. See, I told you last time that after joining that server operating system computer as a part of the member server, the name of this computer will get removed from the organization unit of this, and it will move over here. You see, now we have got two servers and both are having the global catalog and they are in the first side. See here. So this proves that our failover domain controller process is almost done. Now another thing that we need to do in primary domain controller is changing of IP, because previously we have pointed to ourselves mentioning that there is only one domain controller in our network. So that's why our primary DNS server IP address is the only one that we have typed. But now we have to set in a primary domain controller also, saying that we do have a additional domain controller. That means if the primary domain controller fails, the client should be able to work via your additional domain controller. So that will be done with the help of your IP setting over here. And this IP changing has to be done in primary domain controller as well as your additional domain controller. So let it come over here. It's taking time, no problem. By the time, let's see in additional, okay, still it's installing, but the work is done. You have already seen the name. Okay, now we'll bring a small change in a primary domain controller IP configuration as well as the additional domain controller configuration. So let's see over here. If I see my IP address is something like this 100, and the DNS IP address is also the same thing. You know the meaning of this is same. Okay, this started since Windows 2008. Before that we didn't have like this kind of issue, because 127 means this device itself, that we call a loopback. So over here what I need to do is I need to point it out over here, saying that my additional domain controller's IP is this. That means my alternate DNS server is also configured in my network environment. That means if my primary domain controller fails, the authentication for the user will be done from the failover server, and that is the alternate DNS server 101, which is being configured over here. See, this is already done now. Okay, now this server will get started, and whatever changes are done in a primary domain controller, and that will be copied to the another one as well. So IP setting is done. Now in our secondary or additional domain controller also IP has to be changed. So what I'm going to write, the small change in our additional domain controller, let it start first, then I'll show you. By the time I'll show you the primary domain controller's entire setting. Now the failover configuration is already done. It's not a big work over here actually. Now if I see domain controller, see now. Now the replication task is done, which will be done from here. Site and services will make sure that both the computers are in the same site. By the time your additional domain controller starts, I'll show you that setting. Now here, if I open this, see in the default site, if I expand this server, see both the computers are here, both. See here, right click, all tasks, check replication topology. We need to check this also. Okay, you will need to refresh the site controller to see any changes. Okay, it's done. Okay, now this computer will get listed over here. See now, automatically it is done. Now replicate. Okay, now we'll replicate both. Right click, all tasks, click replication topology. Okay, device should get listed over here. Sorry. Because it's starting, that's why. Okay, the secondary or the failover domain controller is yet to come, that's why it's taking time. So let's see now secondary. See, it's starting now. Have patience and see step-by-step procedure. Now this will take your additional domain controller has restarted, and now we will see that entire objects from the primary domain controller should be copied from primary domain controller to your this failover domain controller. Okay, that means your users, your this computers, okay, your domains. If you remember, last time I created one user account, okay, as a testing, and over here including that user account object has to be listed. So now initial configuration test is left, that I told you last time. Okay, it will take the initial configuration test. See, it's coming. This server manager displaying screen means that is the ICT, initial configuration test. It's a testing for the server to make sure the entire things are done properly, or it is functioning, or it's in a state of functioning properly. So that's why by the time it comes, we cannot start any of the process in the server, any server operating system after server 2003. Okay. So bear with me for a few more seconds. By the time the server manager loads, then I'll show you that the primary domain controller has successfully replicated to the additional domain controller in a form of your failover server. Okay. So let's see, still it's taking time, no problem. While working in a server, sometimes we need to have a patience also, guys, because it takes time. Sometimes it takes 1 or 2 minutes, sometimes it might take an hour. So we do not have this precise answer on that, because see, there's sometimes some sort of this technical issues will come across for which there is no technical answer. Straight technical answer is not there for that. So you need to have a patience. Okay, it's loading now. I just wanted to show you that the replication is done. Okay, in order to see the replication, why should I go for the graphical? Let's do this one. Let's start the your CUI also. Now you need to make a habit for CUI also. We'll go to the directory service console straight. That means Active Directory users and computers, through which we can see all the objects are replicated in our additional domain controller. Rather than going to the GUI, I have used a CUI. Still server manager is being loaded, so that's why it's taking time. Okay, now let's see. It started server manager, and then it will take you to the Active Directory users and computers, where we can see the change object. Now let's see, this is our additional domain controller. See now, all the objects we created last time will get listed here. See, remember this object was created in a primary domain controller. Now it has been successfully copied to the failover domain controller. See over here. Whereas if I create any of the object, okay, in my additional domain controller, that will be replicated in a primary domain controller as well, because that is the only idea. Okay, let's say let's say username Ram I'm going to create in my primary additional domain controller, and I want to see that whether this is copied to the primary domain controller or not. It should be copied, otherwise our purpose is failed. It won't take much time when you replicate. Okay, sometime it happens. Okay, now user is created. If I go to primary domain controller, okay, now over here let's go to the primary domain controller that is being already copied successfully. See now, I expand this, refresh this, it will come after a few seconds. It will replicate, don't worry, it takes time, but it will replicate. I don't want to do that. Okay, let's refresh it. Controller, let's see our user object was created successfully or not. Okay, usually it takes few minutes, okay, and after that only it will get replicated in a primary to failover server, and from the failover server to the your primary domain controller. Okay, so let's see that now it is replicated or not. It takes few minutes to copy this. Have patience for that. I hope by this time the replication process is done. Okay, you see this? This user is now replicated from failover domain controller to the primary domain controller. It's not only about creating and replicating the object, even your entire group policy can be replicated from your primary domain controller to the additional domain controller. So I hope all of you got a bit idea about creating a failover domain controller in your network infrastructure, so that your network will never break down. I hope it was a fruitful learning. It was a good journey. In our next session, we are going to learn how to create a read-only domain controller in our network infrastructure. And I'd like to thank you for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe. Thank you.